New recruit was bullied relentlessly. Then he snapped and went savage on the battlefield. In the Appalachian Mountains of Tennessee, Marcus Thompson grew up in a modest household with his family, including his older brother Jake, his deeply devout mother Sarah, and his father William, a weathered veteran of the Great War. The family lived by strict moral principles, with Sarah constantly reminding her sons about the sanctity of life and the importance of following God's commandments. One sweltering afternoon, when Marcus was just 12 years old, a heated argument between him and Jake escalated into a physical altercation. In a moment of desperation and self-defense, Marcus grabbed a heavy stone and struck his brother across the head. Jake collapsed instantly, blood streaming from his wound, and for several terrifying minutes, Marcus believed he had killed his own brother. Though Jake survived with only a severe concussion, the incident left Marcus profoundly shaken and filled with guilt. His mother's words that evening cut deeper than any physical wound. "What you did today, Marcus," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "was the gravest sin a person can commit. To raise your hand against another human being, especially your own blood, goes against everything God teaches us." Those words would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life, shaping his unwavering commitment to never again harm another soul. 15 years later, Marcus had grown into a thoughtful young man who spent much of his time volunteering at the local Methodist church. His quiet demeanor and gentle nature made him popular among the congregation, particularly the elderly parishioners who appreciated his willingness to help with various tasks around the church grounds. One ordinary Tuesday afternoon, while walking home from the church, Marcus witnessed a horrific automobile accident. A delivery truck had collided with a sedan at high speed, and the driver of the sedan was trapped inside with severe injuries. Without hesitation, Marcus rushed to the scene, quickly removing his leather belt and using it as a makeshift tourniquet to stop the arterial bleeding from the man's leg. He then helped extract the victim from the wreckage and accompanied him to the county hospital. At the hospital, Dr. Harrison, the attending physician, was impressed by Marcus's quick thinking and medical knowledge. "Young man," he said, "your actions today saved this man's life. Have you ever considered a career in medicine?" Marcus explained that while he had always dreamed of becoming a doctor, his family's financial circumstances had never allowed him to pursue higher education. While waiting in the hospital corridor, Marcus noticed a beautiful young nurse named Elizabeth moving efficiently between patients. Her compassionate demeanor and professional competence immediately captured his attention. Desperate for an excuse to speak with her, he volunteered to donate blood on the spot, even though he had a mild fear of needles. The next day, Marcus returned to the hospital, dressed in his finest clothes and carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers he had picked from the mountainside. He mustered the courage to ask Elizabeth out for coffee, and to his surprise, she accepted. Their first date went remarkably well, despite Marcus's obvious nervousness around women. Elizabeth found his sincerity and genuine kindness refreshing compared to the other young men she had encountered. However, their evening ended on a slightly awkward note when Marcus, overcome with emotion, kissed Elizabeth without warning. She gently pulled away and explained that she would have preferred if he had asked first. Despite this minor misstep, Elizabeth was charmed by his earnestness and agreed to see him again. As their relationship blossomed over the following weeks, Elizabeth began sharing her medical textbooks with Marcus, helping him learn about anatomy, physiology, and basic medical procedures. She was amazed by his natural aptitude for medicine and his genuine desire to help others. Their bond deepened as they spent hours discussing medical cases and treatment options. Meanwhile, the world outside their peaceful mountain community was changing rapidly. The Second World War was raging across Europe and the Pacific, and young men throughout the country were being called to serve. One evening, Jake shocked the family by announcing that he had enlisted in the army and would be shipping out for basic training within the week. The news devastated their parents. Sarah was horrified by the thought of her son going to war, believing that taking human life was a mortal sin, regardless of the circumstances. William's reaction was even more intense. The sight of Jake in his military uniform triggered painful memories of his own service in the trenches of France. The psychological scars from that conflict had never fully healed, and he couldn't bear the thought of losing his sons to the same horrors he had witnessed. Not long after Jake's departure, Marcus made his own decision to enlist. However, he was determined to serve as a medic, reasoning that he could contribute to the war effort while staying true to his moral convictions about not taking human life. When he shared this decision with Elizabeth, she was initially concerned but ultimately supportive of his desire to serve his country. Before leaving for military service, Marcus proposed to Elizabeth during a quiet evening walk through the mountains. He explained that he wanted to have something to fight for, something to come home to. Elizabeth accepted his proposal, and they planned to marry during his first leave from training. The night before his departure, Marcus visited his father, who was standing solemnly in the family cemetery beside the graves of his fallen comrades from the Great War. William's voice was bitter as he spoke about the futility of war and the false promises of glory that had lured so many young men to their deaths. "I've already buried too many good men," he said, his eyes fixed on the weathered headstones. "I don't want to bury my sons, too." On the morning of his departure, Elizabeth gave Marcus a small leather-bound Bible with her photograph tucked inside the front cover. It was a token of their love and her faith that he would return safely. Marcus promised to carry it with him always, no matter where his service might take him. Upon arriving at Fort Campbell for basic training, Marcus was assigned to a barracks with 11 other recruits. Among them was a tough, street-smart soldier named Rodriguez, who immediately dubbed Marcus Mountain Boy due to his rural accent and humble demeanor. Rodriguez had a habit of casually flipping a switchblade knife while talking, which made several of the other recruits nervous. Their drill instructor, Sergeant Murphy, made a dramatic entrance on their first day, bursting through the barracks door with a thunderous roar that sent the recruits scrambling. The sudden shock caused Rodriguez to drop his knife, which landed blade first in his boot, while another recruit named Peterson was caught completely undressed and didn't even have time to grab his clothes. Sergeant Murphy embodied every stereotype of a military drill instructor: loud, aggressive, and quick to find fault with every recruit based on their appearance, background, or perceived weaknesses. Marcus, however, found the sergeant's over-the-top performance almost comical, which only seemed to irritate Murphy further. During the initial weeks of training, Marcus excelled in physical fitness and outdoor survival skills, thanks to his upbringing in the mountains. However, he struggled with certain technical aspects of military training, particularly equipment maintenance and weapons handling. The real problems began when the unit progressed to firearms training. When ordered to pick up a rifle for the first time, Marcus politely but firmly refused. Sergeant Murphy immediately dragged him to Captain Morrison's office, where Marcus explained that he had enlisted specifically as a medic and had been assured that he would not be required to handle weapons. He further explained that as a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, he could not participate in training activities on Saturdays, as that was his Sabbath day. Captain Morrison found Marcus's position both amusing and frustrating. He was convinced that any soldier who refused to follow basic orders would be unreliable in combat situations. Without hesitation, he ordered Marcus to undergo a psychiatric evaluation, assuming that anyone who refused to carry a weapon must be mentally unstable. That evening, Sergeant Murphy addressed the other recruits in the barracks, making it clear that Marcus could not be trusted in battle due to his refusal to bear arms. He implied that Marcus's religious convictions were nothing more than cowardice disguised as piety. This announcement created immediate tension within the unit, with some soldiers viewing Marcus as a liability and others remaining neutral. Later that night, Rodriguez attempted to provoke Marcus by snatching his Bible and threatening to tear it apart. He expected Marcus to react violently, but instead, Marcus calmly asked for the book back, saying simply, "Please, that's very important to me." His composed response surprised Rodriguez, who had never encountered someone who refused to be baited into a fight. The next morning, Marcus underwent his psychiatric evaluation with Dr. Stevens, a military psychiatrist. During the interview, Marcus clearly articulated his beliefs and explained that he had no mental health issues or delusions. He simply held strong religious convictions that prevented him from taking human life. Dr. Stevens determined that Marcus was completely sane and did not qualify for a medical discharge. By military law, this meant that Marcus was permitted to continue serving as a combat medic, provided he met all other training requirements. However, Captain Morrison was determined to find a way to remove Marcus from his unit. Since he couldn't legally discharge him, Morrison ordered Sergeant Murphy to make Marcus's life as difficult as possible, hoping to force him to quit voluntarily. From that point forward, Marcus was assigned the most unpleasant duties available: cleaning latrines, scrubbing floors, kitchen patrol, and any other menial task that Murphy could devise. The harassment escalated when Murphy began denying weekend passes to the entire unit, making it clear that Marcus's presence was the reason for this collective punishment. The resentment among the other recruits reached a boiling point one night, when a group of them cornered Marcus in the shower room and beat him severely. They blamed him for their loss of privileges and accused him of being a coward who was using religion as an excuse to avoid combat. Marcus absorbed the beating without fighting back, refusing to raise his hand against his fellow soldiers. The next morning, Sergeant Murphy noticed Marcus's bruised face and for the first time seemed genuinely concerned about his welfare. He advised Marcus to request a transfer or discharge for his own safety, but Marcus refused, stating that he was committed to serving his country regardless of the personal cost. When questioned about his injuries, Marcus claimed they were the result of an accident during physical training. He refused to identify his attackers, knowing that doing so would only make his situation worse. His refusal to retaliate or seek revenge actually began to earn him a grudging respect from some of the other soldiers. As the training cycle neared completion, all the recruits were granted leave except Marcus, who was arrested for insubordination and confined to the base stockade. The charges stemmed from his continued refusal to handle weapons and his inability to complete certain training requirements due to his religious observances. While Marcus sat in his cell, Elizabeth waited for him at the small mountain church where they had planned to be married. Hours passed, and it became clear that something had gone terribly wrong. Elizabeth knew that Marcus would never abandon her without explanation, so she began making desperate phone calls to find out what had happened. Captain Morrison visited Marcus in his cell and offered him a deal. If he would plead guilty to the charges and accept a dishonorable discharge, he could be released immediately and return home. Marcus steadfastly refused, insisting that he had done nothing wrong and that his religious convictions were protected by the Constitution. Elizabeth eventually learned of Marcus's situation and traveled to the base to visit him. She pleaded with him to compromise, arguing that he could complete the weapons training without ever intending to use the skills in combat. Marcus remained unmoved, explaining that even touching a weapon would violate his deeply held beliefs. Desperate to help her son, Sarah contacted William and begged him to intervene. That night, William donned his old military uniform, complete with all the medals and decorations he had earned during the Great War. The next morning, he arrived at Fort Campbell and demanded to speak with his former commanding officer, who had since been promoted to brigadier general. At Marcus's court-martial hearing, he maintained his plea of not guilty to all charges. Just as the military judge was about to render his verdict, William burst into the courtroom carrying an official letter from the brigadier general. The letter reminded the court that conscientious objector status was protected by federal law and that Marcus had the right to serve as a non-combatant medic. Faced with the potential for a constitutional challenge and unwilling to risk a confrontation with higher authorities, the military court dismissed all charges against Marcus. He was cleared to begin training as a combat medic, though he would still be required to serve in combat zones alongside infantry units. Marcus and Elizabeth finally celebrated their wedding in a small ceremony at the base chapel. Their honeymoon was brief, as Marcus was scheduled to deploy to the Pacific Theater within weeks. They spent their few days together making plans for their future and promising to write to each other every day. By early 1945, Marcus's unit, the 82nd Infantry Division, was deployed to the Pacific island of Saipan. The moment they arrived, they were confronted with the brutal reality of war. Bodies being loaded onto trucks, wounded soldiers being evacuated, and the constant sound of artillery in the distance. They were there to replace units that had suffered heavy casualties in previous battles. Marcus was assigned to work with two other medics, both experienced veterans who had seen action in previous Pacific campaigns. They briefed him on the enemy tactics and the particular challenges of providing medical care in jungle warfare conditions. The Japanese forces were known to deliberately target medics, so Marcus was ordered to remove his Red Cross insignia and blend in with the regular infantry. A few days after their arrival, the unit received orders to assault a strategic position known to the soldiers as Devil's Peak. This heavily fortified ridge controlled access to the island's main airfield, and its capture was essential for the success of the overall campaign. Previous attempts to take the position had failed, resulting in massive casualties for the attacking forces. The assault began at dawn with a massive naval bombardment designed to weaken the Japanese defenses. As explosions rocked the hillside, Marcus's unit began their advance up the steep, rocky slope. The battle was unlike anything Marcus had imagined. The noise was deafening, the smoke was choking, and the chaos was overwhelming. Despite the terrifying conditions, Marcus never hesitated to rush toward wounded soldiers, regardless of how dangerous the situation might be. He crawled through machine gun fire to reach injured men, dragged them to safety, and provided medical care under the worst possible circumstances. Several times, Japanese soldiers came within yards of capturing him, but other members of his unit fought desperately to protect him. Rodriguez, who had initially mocked Marcus during training, now fought with fierce determination to keep him alive. He had witnessed Marcus's courage under fire and had developed a deep respect for the young medic's dedication to saving lives. Their relationship had evolved from antagonism to genuine friendship, forged in the crucible of combat. After hours of brutal fighting, darkness fell and the American forces dug in for the night. Sergeant Murphy warned everyone to stay in their foxholes, as moving around in the dark would be extremely dangerous. However, Marcus insisted on searching for wounded soldiers who might still be alive on the battlefield. Against direct orders, Marcus ventured into no man's land and managed to locate several injured soldiers. He dragged them back to safety one by one, often under enemy fire. When he finally returned to his own foxhole, Rodriguez was amazed by his dedication and asked him why he was willing to risk his life for strangers. That night, as they huddled in their foxhole, Marcus shared the traumatic memory that had shaped his entire worldview. He told Rodriguez about the incident with his brother Jake and how it had led to his commitment never to harm another human being. He explained that he saw every wounded soldier as someone's son, brother, or husband, and he couldn't bear the thought of leaving them to die alone. Rodriguez, in turn, shared his own painful backstory. He had grown up in poverty in Detroit, never knowing his father and eventually being abandoned by his mother. The army had given him purpose and belonging for the first time in his life, and he had initially viewed Marcus's pacifist beliefs as weakness. Now he understood that Marcus's convictions represented a different kind of strength. At dawn, the Japanese forces launched a massive counterattack that caught the Americans completely off guard. The enemy had infiltrated their positions during the night and began attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. Sergeant Murphy immediately ordered a full retreat, and the naval fleet began providing covering fire as the soldiers scrambled down the ridge. In the chaos of the retreat, Rodriguez was struck by enemy fire and mortally wounded. Marcus tried desperately to save him, but the injury was too severe. As Rodriguez lay dying, he pressed his dog tags into Marcus's hand and whispered, "Tell my squad I wasn't afraid." Marcus was devastated by the loss of his friend, but had no time to grieve. While the rest of the unit retreated to safety, Marcus remained on the battlefield. He could hear the cries of wounded soldiers who had been left behind, and he felt compelled to help them. Captain Morrison led the retreat and established a defensive position at the base of the ridge, leaving only a few observers to monitor the situation. For the next several hours, Marcus worked alone on the battlefield, locating wounded soldiers and using ropes to lower them down the steep cliff face to safety. The task was exhausting and dangerous, as Japanese patrols were constantly searching for survivors. Several times, Marcus had to hide among the dead to avoid detection. Captain Morrison, realizing what Marcus was doing, called in artillery strikes to provide cover and distract the enemy forces. However, this also made Marcus's position more precarious, as he was now working in an active combat zone with explosions happening all around him. As the day wore on, Marcus rescued soldier after soldier, including several Japanese troops who were too wounded to pose a threat. He treated their injuries with the same care he showed to American soldiers, driven by his belief that all human life was sacred. Some of the Japanese soldiers were initially suspicious of his intentions, but they quickly realized that he was genuinely trying to help them. At one point, Marcus discovered a hidden tunnel system that the Japanese had been using to move troops and supplies. While hiding in one of the tunnels, he encountered a wounded enemy soldier who was barely conscious. Following his medical oath, Marcus administered morphine and bandaged the man's wounds, even though the soldier could have been carrying weapons or explosives. As darkness fell, Marcus continued his rescue efforts by moonlight. His hands were cut and bleeding from handling the rough ropes, and he was exhausted from the physical demands of the work. He prayed constantly for strength and guidance, drawing on his faith to sustain him through the ordeal. By dawn of the second day, Marcus had rescued more than 60 soldiers from the battlefield. Captain Morrison was astounded when he saw the steady stream of wounded men being brought down from the ridge. One of the rescued soldiers finally explained what had happened. The same man they had once dismissed as a coward had single-handedly saved dozens of lives. Marcus eventually found Sergeant Murphy and another soldier, both wounded but alive. Murphy had been shot in the leg and was unable to walk, while the other soldier had suffered a head injury and was barely conscious. Marcus immediately began treating their wounds and preparing to evacuate them to safety. As he worked, a Japanese sniper targeted Marcus from a concealed position. The bullet struck his helmet but was deflected by the metal, saving his life. Murphy still had ammunition in his rifle, so Marcus made a dangerous decision. He deliberately exposed himself to draw the sniper's fire, revealing the enemy's position so that Murphy could eliminate the threat. The plan worked perfectly. The sniper fired again, missing Marcus but giving away his location. Murphy's return shot was accurate, and the immediate danger was eliminated. Marcus then began the difficult task of moving both wounded soldiers to safety while Japanese patrols searched for survivors. Using a makeshift stretcher, Marcus dragged Murphy and the other soldier toward the edge of the ridge. Japanese soldiers spotted them and began pursuing, but Murphy provided covering fire while Marcus continued moving toward the evacuation point. Just as they reached the cliff edge, Captain Morrison and a squad of soldiers arrived to provide assistance. Marcus made a desperate leap from the ridge, landing safely at the bottom where medics were waiting to treat the wounded. Japanese soldiers appeared at the edge of the cliff, preparing to fire down at the survivors, but Morrison's men eliminated them before they could shoot. Marcus was immediately taken to the field hospital, where he received treatment for his injuries and exhaustion. He learned that one of the other medics in his unit had been killed during the battle, making his efforts even more crucial to the unit's survival. Captain Morrison visited him in the hospital and offered a sincere apology for his earlier treatment. "I was wrong about you, Thompson," Morrison said. "You've done more for this unit and this country than any soldier I've ever served with. I'm recommending you for the Medal of Honor." Marcus was uncomfortable with the praise, insisting that he had only done what any medic would have done under the circumstances. The next day was Saturday, Marcus's Sabbath. Captain Morrison told him that the unit would be attacking Devil's Peak again and that he would respect Marcus's religious observances if he chose not to participate. However, Marcus decided that the needs of his fellow soldiers outweighed his personal religious practices, and he volunteered to join the assault. The entire unit waited respectfully while Marcus completed his morning prayers before the attack began. This time, the Americans had reinforcements and better intelligence about the enemy positions. They also had knowledge of the tunnel system that Marcus had discovered, which gave them a significant tactical advantage. The battle quickly turned in favor of the American forces. The Japanese defenders, weakened by the previous day's fighting and cut off from their supply lines, were unable to mount an effective defense. However, the enemy commander attempted one final desperate tactic. A small group of Japanese soldiers approached the American positions, waving a white flag, apparently seeking to surrender. However, it was a trap. When they got close enough, they produced concealed grenades and attempted to detonate them among the American troops. The enemy soldiers were immediately shot down, but Marcus was injured while trying to deflect one of the grenades to protect his comrades. Despite his injuries, Marcus continued working until the battle was over and the ridge was secured. As he was being evacuated on a stretcher, he realized that his Bible had fallen from his pocket during the fighting. The other soldiers stopped the evacuation, retrieved the Bible, and placed it back in his hands before continuing to the medical station. The American forces ultimately achieved a decisive victory, capturing Devil's Peak and breaking the Japanese defensive line. The enemy commander, following the traditions of his military code, committed ritual suicide rather than face the shame of defeat. The victory opened the way for the final assault on the island's main objectives. In the aftermath of the battle, Marcus learned that he had rescued 78 soldiers from the battlefield, including both American and Japanese troops. His actions had saved more lives than anyone thought possible, and his courage under fire had inspired the entire unit. He became the first conscientious objector to receive the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for military valor. Marcus and Elizabeth remained married for the rest of their lives, eventually settling in a small town in Tennessee, where Marcus worked as a hospital administrator. He never sought recognition for his wartime service, always insisting that the real heroes were the soldiers who didn't make it home. Elizabeth supported his quiet dignity and shared his commitment to helping others throughout their marriage. Despite his heroic actions, Marcus never changed his fundamental beliefs about violence and warfare. He remained a pacifist throughout his life, believing that his military service had been a calling to preserve life rather than take it. He spoke occasionally at veterans' gatherings and church services, always emphasizing the importance of faith, courage, and compassion in the face of adversity. The Battle of Devil's Peak became a symbol of American determination and sacrifice in the Pacific Theater. Marcus's story inspired countless others to consider how they might serve their country and their fellow human beings, even in the most challenging circumstances. His example demonstrated that heroism could take many forms and that moral courage was just as important as physical bravery. Years later, when asked about his experiences during the war, Marcus would always deflect attention from his own actions and instead talk about the bravery of the soldiers he had served with. He believed that his role had been to support and preserve the lives of the real heroes, the men who had been willing to sacrifice everything for their country and their comrades. Marcus Thompson passed away peacefully in 2003 at the age of 85, surrounded by his family and friends. His legacy lived on through the countless lives he had touched, both on the battlefield and in the decades of quiet service that followed. He had proven that a person could remain true to their deepest convictions while still answering the call to serve something greater than themselves.